there's too many meetings already. So this just added to people's workload. And if you weren't getting it out of a lesson, or if you didn't know that the product was a lesson learned, you weren't striving necessarily to get to it, here's what happens. It's going to be a lot of high-fiving. Yeah, we did great. That was awesome. We got the contract. Nobody wants to hear the critical conversation.
Today's guest is an expert in safety leadership and organizational change. Andrew is the CEO of System Safety and a retired executive from BP, where he and his team cut safety incidences by 70%, the best safety performance in the company's history. Andrew is also the author of Delivering the Right Stuff, a book that shows how lessons from the airline industry can transform any organization's safety culture. He's known for challenging outdated approaches, eliminating blame, and designing systems that learn from mistakes without losing accountability. Okay, as a reminder, please share this episode if someone you know could benefit from the badass wisdom that's included in it. Be their personal leadership upgrade. Do it now. Okay, join me, Angela Gill Nelms, on today's episode of the Badass Leaders Podcast, where I'm joined each week by industry experts for intimate and eye-opening discussions about the challenges and joys facing the leaders of today. Listen in and get ready to scale your company, grow your brand, and unlock your full badass potential. Well, I'm excited about this. I had never heard of human factors work until I interviewed Brandon Williams I wrote it down, on episode 8. And he was a former fighter pilot. Now he's a pilot at an airline that shall not be named. He lives in Atlanta. So
that's super obvious.
Maybe you could figure out. But we did not name it in the episode. So, I have no idea. There are lots of airports through here. Lots of airlines. Anyways, and so I learned a little bit about it. And I also have been, in my earlier days, I proctored surgeries, and that's when I really started understanding the value of checklists. Okay. And so we're preparing for this, and I'm like, this is my person. This is my human.
I've got a breadth of experiences and professions that have helped me learn from each other, quite frankly. Now, I'll give you this, though. I'm a process guy, and what you sent me for preparatory work, etc., huge appreciation, and love the professionalism that it lays out front before you even start. So kudos to you and your team.
Oh, wow. Well, Katie, when you listen to this and edit it, he just gave you additional kudos. She's amazing. Yeah. Absolutely amazing.
Yeah,
and
don't go
I would like to
Katie.
take credit for it, but no, Katie. We want you to have career growth while you're still here. We just promoted her to executive producer, and I was having her update everything on her LinkedIn. And then I thought, I'm probably the only leader and quote unquote manager who's encouraging people to update their LinkedIn and then highlighting their excellence and then also saying, but Katie needs to continue to stay here and continue growing here.
Very true. That speaks volumes to your leadership.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
It speaks volumes. You actually encourage growth out of her and wow, you almost set her up for success post Angela.
Well, I think that should be the goal of every leader, right? Well, when we were building my first startup company, one of the things, and that's really when I started this 5 resume bullet point program, and I started encouraging people, update your LinkedIn. As you do things, go and update your LinkedIn and all of this. And I remember some people said, well, typically when someone's updating their LinkedIn, it means they're about to leave. And I said, well, first off, they probably don't have a badass leader as a collaborator. And I said, from my perspective is when I was building Florence, I said, I really want you to stay here at least 3 years. Now, Katie, you're listening to this. You should stay with the AGN Group longer than 3 years. But anyway, so I was like, I want you to at least stay for 3 years. And then when you go to interview for another job, if I've done my job well, then you've grown so much in those 3 years that any job you interview for, you are the top candidate. Yeah. You get hired. And that company says, wait, you came from this company and you grew this much like that. And so it speaks about our brand as well. So I see it as a win-win.
Interesting enough on that subject, though, also she won't want to leave because of the safe place you've provided for her. And so ultimately that's because it's I hate to say it, it's not green. For her world, it ain't greener on the outside. You can chase money,
I
but that doesn't
agree.
mean you're going to be happy.
And just if you saw, Andrew, how much when I talk to people about Katie, I can get teary eyed because the amount she has grown since October of last year is, I mean, unbelievable. Like literally unbelievable. Even if I had set goals for her in October of last year, I mean, we did set goals, but she's tripled what I would have thought in this period of time she would have been able to grow.
Fantastic. You've got a fingerprint on that, by the way.
Oh, thank you. How
You're
about we
welcome.
talk about you?
That's a fighter pilot joke, by the way. So here's the fighter pilot joke: is that I went out there last night with a Navy F-18 fighter pilot, good friend of mine. It was great to see him. Do you know how I could tell the evening was half over? It was the point of the conversation when our Navy fighter pilot goes, "You know what, Andrew? I'm tired of talking about me. Why don't you talk about me?" It's pretty solid.
Yeah, okay. I love that. I love that. Well, we're going to talk about you and your amazing leadership. So first off, welcome to the Badass Leaders Podcast.
Thank you.
I'm so grateful. One of my big things is that I strongly believe anytime you say yes to something, it means you're saying no to something else. And so you should choose your yeses wisely. And so first off, I'm grateful you said yes to this.
Thank you. Great. Glad to be
And
here.
now, yes, awesome. And now for the listeners, can you introduce yourself and then tell them a little bit about why you're here? And then let's dig into your background about how you got to this stage in your life.
You bet. Andrew Dingee, a little background, Illinois raised, joined the Marine Corps in 1988. Went through flight school for the Marine Corps, winged, flew Harriers on the East Coast, became an instructor pilot, went down to Kingsville. In 99, left. I stayed in the reserves of the Marine Corps, but then I went over to United Airlines and flew for them. Did a couple of combat tours, flew for United. I did safety work at United, which was kind of the linchpin, and I'm grateful for the experience that they gave me. And then at that point in 2010, I kind of got more into the consulting world, and we'll probably talk about that in depth, how that happened. And then kind of been going back and forth in consulting, and I still fly for an airline, a major U.S. airline.
I love that. I love that. For a major U.S. airline, we can all kind of guess what that could be.
There you
But there you go. Okay, so most of the listeners before this interview may be unfamiliar with your work. At the end of the interview, they should be really familiar. Also,
Okay.
as a reminder, we will put links to your stuff in the show notes. So listeners, links to his book that we're going to talk about, his Amazon link, all of that will be in the show notes so that you can make sure you learn more from his expertise. So digging in, can you, because I know you've flown, you were in the Marine Corps, you did aviation, then you flew as well within the war that you were talking about. Can you tell us, though, as we transition into corporate, and I know that aviation is really big into the work that you've done, but you've also been a BP executive, and as we're going to talk about, you're now CEO of System Safety. Can you talk a little bit about your journey from going in the airlines to BP, or were you doing both of them at the same time? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, great question. So, yeah, I'm mainly known as a pilot, fighter pilot, then a commercial airline pilot. And if you remember the 2008 financial crisis, the airlines let go a bunch of pilots. I was one of those pilots. I was fortunate enough to get a opportunity to do some leadership consulting up in Prudhoe Bay with BP in 2010. And what happens in April of that year is when Deepwater Horizon sank. And so they had heard somebody had been working for United. I'd done flight safety for United for 5 years. They had heard about, they had somebody up on the North Slope that had this safety background and were intrigued by it, and they were very open to outside perspective. So they brought me down to Houston, and I initially started as a consultant. And then the question that was asked consistently in the hallway was like, Andrew, I can get on an airplane, and the last thing I think about is that airplane going down. Maybe it's a bag is late 1% of the time. Maybe we'll arrive at the gate a little bit late. Maybe it's a mechanical delay. But I never worry about my safety and security. And the question they would ask is, why aren't we that way? And after a major catastrophic loss, I didn't have a good answer. The question, though, made me go find how I could answer it in 30 seconds or less. So I started researching the evolution of commercial aviation. In fact, if I told you in 1990, there was an airplane accident every other month.
Wow.
And that's the shock. So the
Yeah.
system wasn't whole back in 1990, but as I started reading reports from 1970s and saw the causal statements, what was contributing to them, went to the 80s to the 90s, and then the record started getting very good. And I had to come up with an answer. And each chapter of my book is a major accident that changed the industry for good and forever. It was system changes. One of them is checklists. Another one is procedures. One of them is the studying of how we get along in the workplace. That's the human factor element you brought up in the very beginning. How all those become pieces in an accident. And accidents are very complicated. They're not just a pilot error. So once I got the book written and published, that's when BP read the book and pulled me aside and said, would you like to do this as an employee? So I shook my head. I said, absolutely. Great guy to work for. He was very open to the perspective as well. And they made me, I was the first chief standards officer, vice president of safety for BPX, which is basically all the land wells in North America. And that opportunity allowed me to approach a way different angle. I would offer to you energy, utility, even medical to a lot of perspective is that they really aren't strict to standardization. It's really experience based. They drill a lot of wells offshore, still very experience based. It's a good experience, but I make the number up, but it's like 97% good. But if you want to go to the airline good, it's 7 Sigma. There's 6 Sigmas a program how to lean get better. The airline safety record, even though it's been a little not exactly great the last 6 months, but it's still a 7 Sigma reliability system. It's going to get you there safely.
Wow, that's amazing. You know, I was just in Boston this past week at the Bio Conference, and the new FDA commissioner was talking to us. And I love when I hear people talking about learning from basically doing retrospective analysis, right? Or causal analysis, you mentioned, and learning from the things that didn't work or didn't go so well and using that to catapult into how can we ensure that these things improve. And he was really big in the starting of utilizing checklists in surgery. And it was funny because his other surgeons were like, we're not using checklists. You know, this is not happening. Although we laughed because then he said, hey, we're going to do a study on it. And if you participate, you can be one of the co-authors. And they were all like, oh, yeah, I want to be a co-author on this. Right. And it's amazing because I have, because of those days, learned the value of checklists. And I want to skip forward because I know we've talked about a couple of questions. But sometimes when I talk to people about checklists, they think that utilizing some of these tools or these skills that they reduce the innovation or the creativity. And I know that's not the case, and you're an expert about why it's not the case. Tell me more.
Yes. So this is kind of ego gets in the way, right? Their expertise, they've been doing it for so long. I don't need a cheat sheet to go do my work. I've seen that, obviously worked through a lot of it. If you write them correctly, they'll be the first to join. So a quick story. I cover one of these stories in my checklist chapter. I was writing for Schlumberger, which is a major oil and gas service provider. Fantastic company to work for. And they kept making mistakes out in the field. So perforating guns are what they put down in the hard rock that blow up the rock that creates the crack for the oil and gas to come through. And it's real repetitive. They could do this 60 to 80 times per well. So it's very routine work. It's driving a car for them. Okay, now they're dealing with explosives as well. So these guns come out of the hole. They replace them. There's like 4 metal tubes, maybe 12, 16 feet long. Then they just run them back in the hole again, explode and bring them back out. That's all they do. But they would make errors when they rebuilt the perforating guns. Errors that were very simple ones. Errors that would make the gun not fire. And now the issue is risk because you're bringing a loaded gun back to the surface where it could go off and be fatal. The other thing, there's a non-productive time and an inefficiency to the system. So it's going to cost them about $250,000 every time one of these guns don't go off. And what I love about Schlumberger is they measured a lot of their mistakes so they could see if they introduce something new, whether it make a difference or not. So they talked to me. This is human behavior. This is human factors. This is why we make errors in the work site. When it becomes routine work, our error rate probably goes up a little bit more. Okay, so I looked at them. I said, a checklist is the answer. So they said, roger that, write me a couple of checklists. So we wrote 3 checklists that was really field-driven off their mistakes. That if you would check the gun, after you've assembled it off memory, if you would then go back and check to make sure you did the 4 critical things correctly before it goes in the hole, and most people would say, yeah, I already know I did a great, Andrew, I'm really good at my job. But they would read these things, complete the checklist, go put it in the hole. Well, they improved their, they called it a misfire rate, so they reduced when the gun wouldn't go off. I think it was up to 70%. And what I loved about Schlumberger, they measured it was $100 million, and they weren't getting an armed gun to the surface as well, so they reduced risk that somebody could get hurt. What I love is that when I wrote this checklist, the quality director came to me and he goes, Andrew, that's great, I believe in it, I think it's going to make a difference, but you've got to get it past Jose. Jose's the most senior guy who's been doing this. That he could do this job in his sleep, upside down, hair on fire, and not make a mistake. If you can convince him, I think you'll get the field to follow it. So I walked over to Jose, told him the concept of what we're trying to do. I hand him a very simple 5-line checklist. He looks down and he goes, yeah, I see what you're trying to do. I've made all those mistakes. And that's how you write. You got to write them correctly for the most experience to get the buy-in.
Yeah. And I think also a key that you have there is trying to understand who the internal champion is that you need to get super excited about the program and get them on board, and then the rest will follow. So you decided to write this book. You're like working, you're learning and doing these things, and you decide, hey, I'm just going to write a book. And I am going to name it Delivering the Right Stuff, which, how did you pick that as your name?
So as I worked through, the title was the last thing I picked. So I kind of laid out the chapters. I had always had somewhat of an interest in it over like a 4 or 5 year period. And it kind of wrote itself on my laptop. I blew my knee out, so I was stranded, not doing much. So it probably slowed me down a little bit. And it got me to kind of really start writing it. Wrote the whole thing, and when I got done with it, the message I wanted to send to anybody who see the title of it is Tom Wolfe wrote a book called The Right Stuff. It's a fantastic movie. It's a great book. But it was all based on America picking 7 of the best pilots for the Mercury program. And it was based off a lot of ridiculous tests. And what happened then was that the world I came from was not, we weren't looking for the best person in a bunch of really difficult tests. We're going to take your average person and put him into a system, and we'll make him perform as if he's got the right stuff. That's the message, is that the airlines have got a system in place that allows the average guys out there to become fantastic at what they do because of this system.
I'm trying to remember, because I listen to a lot of podcasts and Audible books and things like that. And I recently heard another leadership expert talking about this phenomenon as well. And I think it is for us as leaders, especially as you're building a team, the idea of if you create an environment and you set up with appropriate tools to lead them towards success, then other individuals, and it might be Kofi Smith from the episode that we released this past week, but it is fascinating because I think sometimes what we do is we forget the amount of growth and leadership and performance that someone who's never done something can have if they're provided the right tools.
Absolutely. Check this out. So checklists, one of their obstacles is that some of the experienced folks still won't buy into the checklist, right? Right. And here's the analogy. Have you ever gotten in your car and haven't put your seatbelt on? And then you realize it's not on.
You feel weird. Right.
And it feels really weird, doesn't it? Think about 1960s and 70s when they first started designing them and what a pain in the butt it was to have that on you. That's the cultural shift it has to take. You're asking me, Andrew, to read 6, 7 line items on a checklist that I know I already did these things. And then at that point, I want to get them so used to using them that they forgot to read a checklist. I want that same feeling that the seatbelt should have been on me. That's what the checklist provides. Now, sometimes you have to teach. You have to write them correctly because they have to be written to their errors. Like Jose's story is great because he goes, yeah, I've done all those. I see where you're headed. If you write them incorrectly, you won't get the buy-in. I'll give you one tip. If you write about checking paperwork in it, it's not effective. Because paperwork doesn't usually prevent accidents. So the front line is going to disconnect a little bit if you're saying, did I do my permit to work? That should have already been done. And that permit to work does make you safer, but rarely is it ever forgotten. So you have to measure and understand why and how the mistakes were made.
Okay, so what is the difference then between using muscle memory? Because I think what you were saying is sometimes when you do something repeatedly over and over, if you're not using a checklist, then you can also be perhaps more prone to making mistakes. And when I think of in the past, I think, oh, well, when you're creating muscle memory and you're always doing something in a certain order, why would I be more at risk for making mistakes in that instance?
I love it. So you're going to humor me because I'm going to run you through an exercise and we can
Let's do
come
it.
back
Let's do
to
it.
it. All right.
Okay.
Do me a favor. Go with January to December, month by month, as fast as you can. Out loud.
January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December.
Awesome. Now, do me another favor. I want you to do the same exercise, but go backwards. I want you to start at December, go to January, month by month, as fast as you can. Go.
I knew you were going to say this. December, November, October, September, August, July, June, May, April, March, February, January.
That's exceptionally well, by the way. And closing of the eyes is a great example. So what this is Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman, and when I read his book Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, all I could do was envision accidents, because I always dug into why people made the decisions they made that ended up, crumping metal, if you will, not necessarily always what went well. So in that, reading that book and seeing how we truly have a decision maker that's just two-sided, right? There's the one or the two.
Yep.
One is January, December. That's system one. That's the fast, reliable one. When we talk about our accidents, they occur in routine work. When you're brand new at something, you're very good, you're very conscious. Think about going backwards. You closed your eyes. You managed distractions because you didn't want to look at me, you didn't want to see any response from me, and you didn't want to mess up either because you are on the air. So
Exactly.
you wanted to show perfection, which I love. Okay, so those two computers, what's going on? They don't rest when you're in System 2. System 2 develops a different type of error. But right now, routine work, they will call it complacency. Complacency is a good label, but underneath label, if you really want to go deeper in complacency, it's the errors that are called biases. There's something called plane continuation bias. When I set my mind to go land on that runway, to drive to this destination, I get so sold into it that I start ignoring other symptoms that maybe my plan's not going accordingly. There's a very famous accident in Little Rock with American Airlines where the crews are trained not to land in a thunderstorm, but they landed in the thunderstorm anyway. And they did so with a threat out there, but they were able to mitigate it or normalize it and continue the approach. Flight Safety Foundation, a fantastic organization, advertises 40% of our incidents occur as pilots with plane continuation bias. Now, not saying complacency anymore, it allows you to go, this event was plane continuation bias, and one thing NASA came out and said was that one way...
Can I pause you for a second?
Yeah.
So are you saying planned continuation bias? Does that mean because this is the route, this is what we've planned, we're going to continue, our bias is to continue along this journey regardless of outside factors that should be red flags?
Yep, that's exactly what I was trying to say. Here's a fancy term. Now you're solid. Here's another fancy term: get home-itis. Okay, they say.
Yeah.
They say how many cars are because you're within a couple of miles of your house, etc. You're probably focused thinking somewhere else as well, right? And not looking at maybe lights or other. I don't want to confuse it, but there's a whole bunch. There's 140 biases that rest in complacency. That's just one of them. There's confirmation bias. I know this is right. I'm gonna build my case around it to be right with that outcome that I'm looking for. That's a dangerous one. That's a bad one for leadership as well, right? When the team is speaking up, and yet the boss is looking heads down and continue to drive, you see it everywhere. There's expectation bias. There's something called the halo effect. Being a pilot and an instructor, you have to be careful. Somebody gets a golden child that comes to you, and you relax your standards, right? Because they're going to be so good. And then what happens is that you don't see or grade maybe to the same standard. Quick story. Doug Hurley is the first astronaut for SpaceX. I went through flight school with Doug Hurley. Now, his call sign, this is awesome, was Golden Child.
Oh.
And now he's an astronaut for Elon, right? So it's a,
right.
But now I'm not taking away his ability to fly. He could fly a great jet, deserved it, right? But it tainted the other instructors as they would come get the Golden Child and go, well, I got Doug Hurley today, piece of cake.
So it basically then because they had a bias that, and we can have this as well when we hire people onto teams and we see their excellence in the past. And so instead of integrating them or maybe giving the onboarding or giving them things set up for success, we're like, oh, no, they've been super successful. I don't need to do that because they're going to crush it.
Spot on. Spot on.
And I was thinking about this. As you were talking about sometimes the errors that you make in certain instances. Okay, so I do beekeeping as a hobby, and I had to tell one of my beekeeping instructor today, like a ridiculous, stupid, dumbass move that I made. But when you are beekeeping and you're inspecting the hive, and then you decide you're going to add more boxes on top because you need more space for bees or you need more space for more honey. My instance was the bees were crushing it. I'm going to put a box on top and so that they create honey. Okay. Well, then I remember when I went to do it, because I'm still relatively new and I didn't have my checklist. Like, for example, you should not put the box on top upside down. That ends up being a problem 2 months later when you're sitting there looking at the system, because a beehive is an amazingly efficient system, right?
Yep.
And I've been talking to one of my other mentors, like, I can't figure out why the bees are hanging out so much in this area and stuff. And then finally, seriously, Andrew, last night, I look at a photo and I see the side handle and I was like, oh, because you're the dumbass who put the thing back together and put the box in upside down the whole time. And that, had I had a checklist, or had I had something that was just reminding me versus just being in a hurry because I hear the bees starting to buzz more and I know they're starting to get a little too excited, then I wouldn't have made that mistake.
Spot on. Here's another one you'll appreciate. Ostrich effect sits under complacency as well. This one is an easy one to talk about. People who put chewing tobacco in their mouth. It says it will kill you. It will give you cancer, right? But not to them. They minimize it, don't they? Because they continue to do it. And so there's 140 of these. The brain is mapped. Daniel Kahneman did a phenomenal job explaining. This has been around for 200 years. He rewrote the psychology of this learning in his words, which really highlighted, I think, professionals to glob onto it to understand our errors and our strengths as well. Here, love this. Why do we like routine work? Just notice how fast you were from January to December and how slow you were going backwards. The boss wants their workers to be in System 1. But the only way to get into System 1 is to use System 2. You use System 2 to go backwards. And if I had you do it every day for a week, you could go just as quickly backwards as forward. And then now you're just working with one System 1. And now you're going to bring biases in that process, if you will, as well.
Well, and Katie, feel free to add into the show notes how many seconds it took me in System 1 versus System 2. And the fact that also System 1, my eyes were open. I was not thinking about it. I was doing it. So I also could observe any inconsistencies I saw in any other area. Yep. However, in System 2, as you mentioned, my eyes were closed. I was so uber focused on each of these steps that it goes back to that example of the basketball and the gorilla. Yeah, is that when you're told focus on just this one thing, then you miss these other things around you.
How about this? They measured a caloric burn to it. It takes more energy to go backwards than to go forward, doesn't it? You actually feel, it's called cognitive strain, but you actually burn more heat, more calories just to run it backwards.
Oh, now I'm inspired. You're going to, Andrew, if you were a fly on my shoulder, you see me out walking, I'm going to be out walking. December, November, October, September. Everyone in Atlanta is going to say, that woman is strange.
No, here's another example. Let's talk multitasking, right? Pilots. Yep. There's a school of people out there that goes, you cannot multitask. I would put a caveat to it. I go, you can multitask. I think I've been asked to multitask in an airplane quite a few times. So I've become a believer in multitasking. Here's the difference. When that conversation comes up with you in the future, you can multitask when you're in System 1. You cannot multitask in System 2. Yes. And it's a perfect example. So if you were doing January to December in routine work and I pitched you a tennis ball to catch, you would catch it. Me slow you down a second, right?
Right.
But you would actually, and it probably wouldn't even interrupt the flow. But if your eyes were open on System 2 going backwards, I pitched you a tennis ball, you have an explicit choice.
It would hit me in the face.
You would have had a choice. Do I want to win this exercise or do I want to catch the ball? And it's an either or scenario. So that's why training of pilots is so important, because we want to put multitasking into System 1. You could break down simple processes. Think about driving a car. Think about all the pressures, the system. How hard do you hold the wheel? How much do you actually turn it to get the turn that you want? The blinker, how much pressure on the brake, how much on the gas? There's actually a lot of information coming in that we're deciding on without ever thinking about it.
Now, this is tying in as well. The System 1 is building that muscle memory, right?
It is. System 2 builds System 1. How's that? You're going to start out in System 2.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Here's what I would do. If you've ever, my daughter is a great example of this. When she became 15 and had to go for a drive, think of the things. I'm in System 1, sitting in the right seat to her, but she's in System 2. She doesn't know how hard to do all this. So the difficulty is to be an instructor, if you will, to translate more information that you take for granted, for the assumptions that, of course, she kind of knows. Video games, whatever you want to use, but they're not there. How to scan, how to look for threats, all that goes into trying to develop her to be a really good System 1 defensive driver. But in essence, her first day, though, she was exhausted when she got out of the car, wasn't she? Because she's in System 2. She's worn out. But more practice you go through is you're moving all that into System 1 to where she's comfortable. And she starts seeing more. She starts looking more not just at the basketball, but she's looking for the gorilla as well.
It's that level of finesse and smoothness then that you can get, and the confidence that built. I remember when I first started, I no longer race Ironman races, but when I used to race Ironman races, I remember before one of my races, my coach said, you have to practice being handed a water bottle while you're still cycling and have that transition. And first off, I remember when she told me that, I was like, that is impossible. And I still could picture myself in a parking lot trying to do it with her. And I literally almost crashed my bike multiple times, okay? And then fast forward, by the time I'd done a couple of Ironmans, then what I learned was, I don't want to be behind that newbie who's just now learning how to do it, right? I want to get my water bottle and stay away from the newbie because they're going to be so focused on trying to grab that. They're going to, jerk back into track. Like, you're going to have all these other instances. So I want to be in this space to where the other individuals are. And I think maybe when we think about the value of learning these things, we want our experts to get to this level because then they can, have a successful surgery or a flight or something else.
You do. People talk about the envelope. The more experiences you get, the envelope grows. And what you're really doing is shoving that learning into System 1 to becomes automated. So I'm doing it without thinking. It's just part of who I am.
So, Andrew, we're talking a lot about high-risk industries. However, I know that there's value for those listeners who are not in high-risk industries. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it can go to manufacturing. What I've learned is I've adjusted the risk discussion. So I love the segue. The risk discussion is no doubt valuable for a lot of companies. But in the end, this is manufacturing. This is if you have people that need to get work done on a routine basis. It's managing out their error rates, giving them tools that does that. To back up a little bit, when we talk about systems and how I got to system safety, if you will, was I realized what I'm really effective at is actually reducing inefficiencies, non-productive times to companies. And it could be production of paintballs. It could be anything else. It doesn't have to be aviation, it doesn't have to be oil and gas, it doesn't have to be utilities, quite frankly. Because the error rates and the mistakes that they make, that's the System 1, System 2 is understanding where they came from and then designing a system around it. One of the biggest things the airlines rely on, and they do it extremely well, is they have really well-written step-by-step procedures. That is a preventative step. SOPs from my world, if it's done correctly, the risk is at its absolute lowest. Okay, and that is what I've worked with some other companies that aren't necessarily a high-risk profile company.
Well, I'm one of these people because I spent a lot of my career in healthcare and in clinical research. And in clinical research, we have a lot of SOPs. And so then when I would mentor and help organizations set up their SOPs, and I think this ties back to the checklist piece when you talked about Jose and him saying, yes, these are the right questions. You don't have these additive extra ones. You have these extra. I think part of that for SOPs, what we would do is we would write an SOP, and then I would say, okay, you need to use this SOP for 30 days, and then let's take a step back and say, are these really the appropriate steps? What do we miss? What do we not have? And then continue, or are we not following it because we didn't do appropriate training? And then once we have it nailed, then that's what your checklist should be, or that's what your SOP should be.
So I'll give you another layer on that as well, right? So the SOP is routine work. You memorize it. Day one, it's system two, it's hard thinking. You're trying to get your hands and all the work that's supposed to get done in the proper sequence. But once you get that all figured out, life is good. And you talked about human factors a little bit in the very beginning. Distractions, fatigue management, things like that can creep in that allow me to make a mistake, a bias, okay? Checklist in the aviation world is, maybe not everybody knows this, but your work is memorized work. Okay, so when we get the airplane off the gate, go get ready for it to take off, etc., that's all memorized work. But we have a pause in the execution when the workload comes down in the cockpit. That's when we pull out a checklist and read it. The checklist actually looks back in time and validates we did the memorized work correct. Checklists are really about human factors. The assumption is I know that distractions or fatigue can get in my way. I won't know it because of the interruption. Okay, so I'll just get to keep going through the work. So it's a latent error that sits in the system. The checklist then is pulled out to go, make sure you did these 5 critical items that could hurt you. And then you move on. Now check this out. There's one more layer that checklists are different a little bit than compared to hospital settings than in the cockpit. One of them is, I read it, but somebody else is checking the work. It's called challenge and response. It's not me reviewing my work, because guess what? I'll probably pencil whip it, and if it's an automated system 1 type behavior, I'll probably just go check, 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 check. But instead, if somebody else is going to come over and look at my work, that's called the Hawthorne effect. I actually check it before somebody else looks at it. And so now I've got my own internal check. Then we read the checklist. That catches an error that could be fatal. We fix the error, and then the system doesn't have the accident. It moves on.
I love you bring up the Hawthorne effect is one of my favorite things. So listeners, if you don't know, and perhaps we'll put the true definition in the show notes, but it is a scientific phenomenon that things that are being viewed and watched do better than things that are not. And even the fact that really the fact that it's going to be viewed and looked at, then cognitively you have that little extra awareness to it because somebody else is going to come back and look at it. And it's why, for example, I go back to clinical research, right? It's also why we see that patients who are filling out their blood pressure diaries and filling out all these things do better when they're in a clinical trial than they do when they're just out in the wild on their own, even if they're on the same meds.
It's a great example. It's exactly what happened. So when I know the captain wants to look at or go over the critical items in the cockpit, I double check myself. Works like a champ. And so now that's the system. If I'm perfect that day, my SOPs, nothing bad happens, right? I'm not perfect every day. And so I will make an error in there. And usually what the airlines work real hard on is to managing distractions. When you close your eyes on system 2, okay? When you don't close your eyes, there's a lot going on in activities, radio calls, maybe flight attendant calls, things like that I could leave one step out of a procedure, but later on, it could be 5-10 minutes when that checklist is read, it gets caught. And then we go to the next amount of memory. Then it would be basically getting the airplane airborne, all off memory. But then before you get up to cruise, you got another checklist that's going to validate the airplane, the critical things to get to cruise flight done, gets done. And so there's only, some people ask me this, there's only 5 checklists that we use to go fly. There's not a bunch of checklists. And there's only, I think one checklist has got about 12 items on it. Most of them are pretty short.
I feel like when I had to pause my pilot's license, but I feel like my checklist when I was taking lessons was a lot longer than that. It must be because I wasn't a fighter pilot and didn't have all that years of experience.
No. So I love the analogy because what they did is the checklist they gave you was a to-do checklist. It was a shrunken procedure.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Ours is not written that way. So you check this out. So if your checklists are present tense, that's a shrunken procedure. So now you're only held accountable to these 12 steps because that's telling you to go check the fuel pumps, do the pre-flight, all that.
Yes, exactly.
That's a procedure. That's not a checklist. Not from the airline perspective of human factors. My checklist is written in past tense, which means I've already done the work. All right, now let's verify that I did do the work.
Okay, this is amazing. Now, I have so many thoughts. Andrew, I'm probably going to be pinging you after this episode thinking of all the additional thoughts I have for this. Because I will probably wake up at 3 a.m. and think of another, I think this could be great. Okay, what I want to talk about now is investigations.
Yes.
Okay, and, can you walk us through what a system safety investigation looks like compared to a traditional safety review?
You bet. So some context. When I was writing the book, I wanted to go back in time and find those accidents that were key to write about, right? And if you read NTSB investigation reports from the 1970s and early 1980s, they literally will say the causal statement was pilot error. Now, the issue with that is, what do you do when it's pilot errors? You get another pilot. Because you want a more perfect pilot, more experienced pilot, put them in. They just weren't going deeper enough to understand System 1, System 2, its faults. They weren't looking at it with that lens. They were just placing people with people. And then you saw them, and the industry went more into human factors, started understanding that how come this guy didn't speak up at work? The pilot to my left absolutely would not listen or take my advice, which is an old United Airlines accident, and they ran an airplane out of gas because the captain wouldn't listen to the other crew members on the fuel state. So it became a pivotal point for the airline industry to come back and go, there's another dynamic here in the cockpit that we haven't really looked at. It's not just pilot error. In this case, it's work relationships. So when human factors came out, when you look at system safety and you look at an investigation that goes beyond pilot error, operator error, whatever you want to call it, the investigator has to look at why they made the decisions with the lens of System 1, System 2, and its failure modes. And if was there dynamics, how were you two getting along? If it's a teamwork, if it's doctors and nurses, did the doctor invite an open speak up culture, or was it very closed? That's one that's probably an obvious one you can gravitate toward.
Yes.
And that's important. Did the captain, or in your case a doctor, was he receptive to input? Or was it always just his way and right? Or was he just going through the process of a debrief, whatever the process is, okay? So they started digging into the psyche of the humans and how we make our mistakes. That's great. That's called preconditions. So you have your unsafe act, the last thing I did that caused the accident. Usually that's where most people stay. They blame the individual for being human. The next step is to get in that human factor conversation. Fatigue management. We measure, and I love it. The airline industry does an exceptional job at measuring fatigue. If it's 2 to 5 a.m., you're fatigued. It's not even a discussion. That's the window of circadian low. Our decision making is not good in that state of mind. I work with a lot of companies that work 24/7. Healthcare does the same. And that you fight it. I've done all-nighters. It's not fun. And I already know that if I had a very complex accident or a complex scenario, my decision making is nowhere near as good as at 8 a.m. So they've done a lot of research on fatigue and science, which has been around for 50, 60 years now, right? So the investigators started looking at what they call the preconditions. Now, as they grew, and James Reason, who's famous for the Swiss cheese analogy, the supervisor
Tell
has
us
a role.
what that is.
Swiss cheese is that, yeah. So if you had a perfect world to operate in, you would have a perfect piece of cheese with no holes in it. But that's not how we operate. We have latent errors in the system. The first one is me and how I showed up to work and my decision making. The second one is the preconditions, the human factors. And when something, like if it is 2 a.m., that puts a hole in that piece of cheese. And I don't have the diagram in my hands, but there's only 4 pieces of cheese, and James Reason, who's an organizational psychologist, quite famous for what he does in accident investigation, each piece of cheese on this 4-piece cheese sandwich has holes in it. And when they all line up is when you have your accident. And so I, as an investigator, I look for the holes because I can find corrective action items that plugs them, that prevents the error from occurring, the very last step, the guy that flips the switch that creates the boom, if you will. So traditionally, go ahead.
No. Carry on. I have another question, but I want to hear more about what you're going to say, the difference traditionally versus where you are leading people to go.
You got it. So traditionally, it's easy, and honestly, leadership just wants to fault the person who made the mistake. It's an emotional throw-up. And I've had to work on people, leadership teams that go, I'll do an in-depth systems approach on the investigation. There's going to be other things that led to the decisions that were made that day. So give me some time, and patience is all I really ask for. I can get 3 to 5 day snapshot of going, this is some of the issues as well. Ergonomics. I used to tell a story of a pilot that ejected out at Yuma. We were doing high CAS, high close air support, so they're dropping bombs at like 16,000 feet. And as they're coming down, we couldn't see him. And we can't clear him hot to drop bombs unless we see the nose of the airplane to make sure he's not dropping on somebody. So he did something that was very non-standard, and he reached down, and he actually was looking for the fuel jettison switch. Because then white vapor comes out of the wings, we could see him, we could clear him hot. You only have a couple of seconds to make that call. Well, he reached down and grabbed the wrong switch. He grabbed what is now it's a digital computer that manages the inflow of fuel and oxygen to the engine. Well, he made it go to the manual mode. The switch was exactly the same. And so when he did that, his engine blew up basically, and then we saw the parachute, and we saw him, and search and rescue went out and grabbed him. but it's a great example of ergonomics can help, unfortunately, or hurt us make bad decisions in the workplace. So that's one level deeper, if you will, to just the pilot error. He didn't show up purposely to make the mistake. And instead, let's find out a little bit of some of the latent errors that are sitting in that system. The third piece is the supervisor. The supervisor, your role with Katie can no doubt have an influence on her day. Okay, in fact, you could tell Katie to go do a shortcut, and she knows better, but you've shut her down so many times that she's given up, right? And then that shortcut eventually leads to you maybe a poor interview. Let's say she forgot to hit the record button. And then you'd be mad at her, right? But there's other issues at play, and this is your piece of that role in that accident. It's not always supervisors have a role, but it needs to be looked into. Then the last thing is the organization. The organization itself, process. We talked a little bit about process, and what I love working with you is how good you are with process. I can tell already. That sets the tone, but also achieves a high level of standard and high level of excellence. And when you have those processes are owned by the organization, so now you can actually tie an accident all the way back through to the company itself that's supposed to be controlling the behavior. I work a lot in procedures because I find a lot of gaps in procedures and like to at least close that, put that lesson learned in there and drive it home. A lot of companies don't necessarily, they will say the procedures were inadequate, but they really don't necessarily rewrite the procedure with making them more adequate for that scenario.
I love all of this. You know, one of the things I was thinking about when you're talking about, okay, this error happened. So go back to this pilot.
Yep.
And he needs to make this, and he goes to grab a switch, and the two knobs or switches, whatever, are the exact same. When I think of analyzing or doing a retrospective and trying to say, okay, where did things go wrong? First off, one of our values is seeing humans as humans. And so we also ask a lot more questions about that human being versus blaming on them. But I love the methodology of using the 5 whys to then say, okay, this happened. And someone's like, oh, because he grabbed the wrong one. Well, why did he grab the wrong one? Well, because they both felt the same, and yet they are very different things. Okay, well, why do they both feel the same? Do they have to be the same knob? Could they be different? Yeah. Could we change the knob so that you have that tactile, and really getting down to the core. So instead of being at the beginning where you just say, he grabbed the wrong knob, now you're suddenly like, okay, wait, we need to redesign this so that tactily speaking, you can tell the difference between the knobs, and that's how you're reducing the error.
Absolutely. You could talk weather too, right? How does weather influence people's decisions at times? It could be nighttime, but not enough outside lighting, so they grab the wrong switch on a panel on a well site. You've got to start looking at it not just from the person who flipped the switch. Set the emotions down, get a real good systematic approach to it from behind, and give it some time to develop.
So tell us a little bit, because I know you talk about building systems that absorb human error rather than punishing it. And tell me more, because I agree 100%. The blame game does nothing. You have no growth, no improvement, anything like that with the blame game. And most organizations are very quick to default to the blame game and then move on to something else. And they haven't actually grown and improved. So can you talk about what does it look like to absorb human error in that instance?
Yeah, and I'll back up, and then we'll go down to that absorbing, right?
Love it. Okay.
Because a lot of people go, hey, Andrew, you're like, but people do make mistakes. Absolutely. The question you have to ask, though, was it malicious? Did he purposely show up and try to wreck the system? Did he really want, a non-predictive time event to come out of it? Was he trying the best he could with what he had available? And the answer is, and I don't know because nobody's really necessarily measured it, but it's less than 1%, right? There are violators out there. And the process of an investigation, it goes, if he knew the risk and took the risk, that's an HR conversation. That kind of changes the investigation of that scope because he purposely, willfully, intentionally did that. The airline industry is really good about that as well, of asking that question. When I make a mistake in the cockpit, I submit a piece of paper. They're going to ask themselves, did Andrew do this on purpose or were there other plays? So that kind of helps also with the blame game, all right? The next step on when it comes to protecting your system, I'll go back to the checklist. That checklist is pivotal for the airline industry because now that you've learned its human factors, it's written in past tense. I've already done the work. I'm checking myself. Somebody else is checking it. That's like 2 or 3 layers deeper than just relying off my memory to go do it. That's what the assumption is that checklist, the way it's designed, it's taken 80 years to design it correctly, by the way. This has evolved slowly over time. If you go back to the original checklist, it was a to-do checklist, by the way. And then it's evolved into some of these other psychological learnings that's made the impact. The past tense, our checklist written in past tense is important because it's telling you, you didn't do this. or if you did, fix it because it's critical to get done. The only other thing about human error I would offer to you that I've learned is that write your procedures to how they conduct their work. If there's a large deviation, if a lot of people, if I wrote an SOP for Katie, it would be a lot longer than you probably thought. Katie's already competent, but I'm not writing it for her. I hope she's not listening.
She will listen.
I wrote her. You'll appreciate this approach.
Katie.
She's gonna be out. I actually wrote her for Katie's replacement.
Yeah.
So this,
absolutely.
Because it's your company, and so your standard doesn't need to go, and you don't want Katie's all her experience to be just with her. You want to grow her and continue to challenge the system, make it better, right? But in the end, you want error-free operation that if she did leave, you can continue to keep your brand as strong as it is.
And Katie will love this because some of my favorite words that I say to teams, especially in my work in building startup companies, because when you're building a startup company, you often start with no procedures. And it's basically when you're thinking about your system 1 versus system 2. And I would say in this instance, you're at a system 3 because you don't even know what the months of the year are at this point, right? And you're having to map them out. And what I say is we should be building processes that create a scalable, sustainable, and robust organization. And that means, and Katie has done that. So, I mean, when we started this podcast, Katie went in and she went into Asana and she did her first guess at what she thought all the steps would be. And then subsequently over 20 something guests, now every time she's like, oh, I should add that step. Or I know that when, for example, when this episode ends, and I click that it's finished, then it automatically runs an algorithm that she built that says these are the next 5 steps that now need to happen because this is the new stage. And none of that existed. She built all of that. And we know that my perspective as well is that if Katie then gets promoted into even a higher level and we hire someone on the team, then she's going to onboard them to this that she's already built out. And she's going to encourage them to make it better as well along the way.
I love it. Do you guys debrief?
Yeah, we debrief. And I also love when she debriefs with me and is like, hey, Angela, next time have the guest put the microphone closer to the mouth. So I'm not spending twice as long trying to fix the audio in these instances. Or an example being sometimes we'll be in a hurry to do something, and we recently released a reel. I'm really passionate about if a guest is on this podcast and we're going to do a reel, we want to highlight important points of the episode, but we want to make sure that anyone watching it is inspired by the guest. So we got to be very careful if you take a snippet, that if the snippet's taken out of context, it might not. And we had one recently that I was just like, message Katie, and I was like, so I think for future, something like this, let's make sure we let it go long enough to get to the motivational piece. And her response was, and because we have this relationship, her response was, you know what, I listened to it. You're absolutely right. I was in a hurry doing this and I did it. And she's like, that's a great point. And I think because she knows that we are both growing this to be the best that we can be, that I'm not attacking her. I'm just like, hey, let's look at this from a different angle.
I love it. I'm a big fan. I learned debriefing as a pilot, so developed thick skin, right? Because I was critiqued every time after a landing. Student, much easier because it's a learning environment. I'm a system 2. I'm trying to make it into system 1 so it becomes my natural habit. It's all good. But it never stopped. Even when I was in a gun squadron flying with other, colleagues, if you will. We got back, we took away the rank, we sat down, and we critically looked at our execution and how we could improve upon it. Sometimes it was just personally, I had to adjust something that I did. Other times we go to the standard. So I'd offer to you, as you work at your company and you're developing these standards, these procedures, that's one measurement I use, whether you're a learning organization. The key is how do you, your company, transfer knowledge to the next person? And if it's assumptions or experience, it's not a very good system approach. And so what I try to do is, like on deep water drilling is a very expensive, very experience-based execution type model. I try to help that community to start capturing these incredible lessons that have been learned 10, 15 years offshore and make it the corporate standard. And then everybody gets measured against that. But it's still not good enough. You still need to go in for your 5-minute debrief and challenge the status quo to where you can improve. You ever heard of 1% marginalized gains? The story?
No, tell me more.
This is a great one. British cyclist, Sir David, I'll come up with his name. Fantastic lesson here, okay? British cycling had won one award in 76 years across Olympics, across tours in Europe, etc. Only one medal they'd ever received. He checks in and he wants to take this as a world championship team. He actually wants to win gold in Beijing. So the way he did this is that he tore down his current cycling team and made it a system, wrote a standard, copied how they currently do work, and then he invited the team to come in and challenge it. And as they challenged it, they knew that small pieces, i.e. change their diet. Everybody's going to eat this way. And when we go over to France for a race, we will eat the same way. We're not going to now all of a sudden eat French food, etc. Not that it was anything against the French, but he saw stability in their diet.
Yeah, exactly.
He saw stability in the diet. They have brought a sleep expert in because they knew how much sleep could actually hurt their energy and their performance. He then looked. This is how well they looked or attacked their system. They painted the floor of their maintenance shop white, so there'd be no dust, because dust was getting in the gears. The little bit of sloppiness they didn't see was getting into it and taking a fraction of a second off. Why that is so extreme, though, is that he had a system in place to look at it. People who don't have standards, who don't live through procedures, never challenge them to actually go to the next level. They actually asked just the person to go do it. So fast forward the 4 years that he did this, and then it's 6 to 8 years in the end, they've won 66 medals. Both Olympics were like 15 Olympic medals, 50-some World Cup titles. He's put British cycling not only on the map, but at the top of the map in like an 8-year span. And wholeheartedly, his process was map current workflows and then invite everybody to come in who's got the experience, who does the work, challenge it, and make us better.
Well, I think, and I want to talk about the difference between a manager and a leader. The thing I love about this right here is this is an excellent example of a leader, because a leader as well is going to be comfortable enough to allow others around to challenge and give input and help make the entire system better versus dictating this is what we're going to do. I know, and I think David Goggins talks a lot about, he does debriefs after everything, and he's so obsessed about it. And I think it's also this idea, if you want your organization or yourself as a human being to continue to grow, to continue to learn, then you're going to continue to optimize. And we can often be very blind ourselves to things. And I hear of other people that have podcasts and they say, oh, I never listened to any of my episodes. And I'm like, wow, if I'd never listened to any of my episodes of my first podcast, I would be nowhere. And even this, I literally, I was in Boston and I'm slacking Katie. And I said, I'm listening to the latest podcast. I say like and okay way too much. I have to stop saying those words. But yeah, the spirit of being humble, that you really just want to be the best that you can be and bring other people along the journey.
Yeah, the biggest, I used to teach, interesting enough, in the medical world, I used to teach some debriefing, et cetera. So doctors and nurses, and salesmen kind of across the spectrum. Here's what happens. People glob onto it. David Goggins, right? I listen to him, debriefing's it, I'm going to go, and it becomes the flavor of the month. For consulting, it's great, and it doesn't work. And here's the biggest takeaway. When corporate America understands the value to debriefing, they make it a meeting. They don't make it a debrief. And when they make it a meeting, people don't want to go to it because it's 45 minutes. It's not structured probably fairly well. Also depends on relationships with the boss, whether he really wants to do it or is he just doing the process. And ask most people, this is always a great consulting question. What's the product of a debrief? It's a lesson learned.
I was just about to say that you've grown something at the end. Yeah, it's like what a meeting should not occur unless there's a decision to be made or a lesson learned from it. And if that's the case, then that's what you should have as an outcome. That's what success looks like, right?
Oh, I love it. So and then this is where I come into play. Where's the lesson learned go?
Well, hopefully, tell me more.
Into your standards, or it becomes a line on a checklist.
Yep.
And then it becomes habitual, and the company now just took another step forward in the right direction as far as that execution they're looking for. But I've seen it go. We worked with Pfizer and their sales team, and they loved it. The concept's great. It's well proven throughout any industry if you go into it, but it's executed in a really below average way. because it got, okay, 45 minutes after this job is over, we're going to sit down for 45 minutes and do it. And that's not what people want to go. There's too many meetings already. So this just added to people's workload. And if you weren't getting it out of a lesson, or if you didn't know that the product was a lesson learned, you weren't striving necessarily to get to it, here's what happens. It's going to be a lot of high-fiving. Yeah, we did great. That was awesome. We got the contract.
Right.
Nobody wants to hear the critical conversation. I'm reading Radical Candor right now. Radical Candor.
It's one of my favorite books. I have it right here on the book. Okay. Oh, you can't see it. It's just outside of, right by Culture Map, Delivering Happiness, Culture Map, and Radical Candor. One of my favorites.
And I'm just getting into it, but I read it, and I'm like, okay, that's got me written on it, because I've had to become a good pilot, quite frankly, I've had to have those conversations with myself and, quite frankly, other people as well, as I was an instructor pilot for years.
Okay, now that means we're going to pivot the questions. So because Radical Candor, okay, so I read that when we were building our first software company, and I remember, and I loved it so much that then every people manager that reported on my team, I had it as required reading. And so listeners, it is on my website. You can see a link. It's listed as one of the books that made me. I will say also Radical Candor for some people can feel a little harsh. So the making of a manager is very similar. It's just a little bit more gentle. But I remember the CEO who I reported to, one day he said, "You are the most radically candid person that I know." And I was just like, that's amazing. And
that's a compliment.
Tie that to, yes, I was like, take it, high five. And tie that to my next question for you is that one of the things we realized, because I was the person in the C-suite that had that skill, that I was the one also not afraid of conflict. And I actually love conflict, because I think when you have conflict, healthy conflict, and you know how to have healthy conflict resolution, then once again, you end up with those nuggets towards success. Like one thing I was thinking about, if I were going to do a debrief, especially with some sales members of some areas, if we were going to be bad and be stereotypical, what I would do is I would say, I'm going to give an award to whoever can come up with the best lesson learned from this or something like this. Turn it into a gamify it in some way so that people are digging deep to find those lessons learned. And so now my question for you is, how do you handle conflict resolution in some of these situations, specifically some of the high risk and also, I would say, highly intellectual and successful personalities?
So my first trick is just if I can get them to admit it first.
Tell me more.
I'll describe the scenario, like how did you perform today if it was a specific maneuver in the airplane? Where would you think? How would you grade yourself? Because I'm testing to see if there's alignment or not on whether we saw it with the same lens, right? And
how do you say that without them getting defensive?
That's pretty much how I just said it. But I'm trying to think.
So when you said that to me in my head, I'll pull a little Brene Brown out here. The story I was telling myself in my head when Andrew said that was backing up and saying, why? Did you not think I was good enough? Of course I was an A+. Why you ask? What did I do wrong?
Okay, so there was this one assumption in my example. I love the scenario. The one assumption is that there was already conflict. There was somebody could pick up on behaviors or tone that made him realize it wasn't going quite to probably my expectations, right?
Nice. Okay.
And so then so the door's a little open already. It didn't necessarily come out of the clear blue. That's a little bit of a harder conversation to probably have. I'll think about it and see if I can get you a better answer. Because a lot of things that I do, it's already there. I mean, people have realized they've damaged equipment, somebody's been hurt, right? And so it's easier to walk into a site. Yeah,
because you're actually reactive instances in this situation. And so I love this, Andrew. So I love conflict so much. My desire is to write a book on conflict resolution because I love it so much. And so you've just pointed out something, is that there are two different types of conflict in this scenario. There's the one type of conflict when everyone knows something went wrong, and now you're trying to dig through it, and you're trying to have challenging, difficult conversations in this instance, okay? And then there's the other kind of conflict where you know things aren't going well, and maybe the other person may or may not know it, but there's no reason that you have to have the conversation. And those are the people who just shove everything under the rug, and they don't handle any conflict because it's easier just to not have that conflict to them.
So I'm a process guy. If that scenario occurred, If you weren't debriefing, I'd probably start a debrief. And then open it with the open-ended questions to go, how do you think it went? What went well? What didn't go well? And then why do you think it did well? And that's going to bubble up the factual understanding of the two scenarios for you to pull out whatever the lesson is for that scenario.
I love that example. I love it. And also I think if you build a culture of having constant debriefs, then it's also a natural thing. So people are less likely to have the guard up.
Yep. And culturally, which is kind of fun, is when you start habitually always debriefing and people realize Andrew's going to ask me to debrief and everything was fine, you will go find something. And again, the 1% marginal gain is, and actually that worked really well. I know that was to standard, but has anybody ever thought it this way? Okay, you had a really good question for me a while ago. It was about standardization, and you're taking my will to think, right? What standardization actually does is it gives you freedom to think. I did a lot of research in the book because I knew there's a pushback, and people are like going, Andrew, you're just trying to make everybody a robot. It's actually the opposite. I'm giving you the tool of a minimum standard you must go execute work to, and now challenge the system and make it better. And that sets up the debrief. Because if you don't have a well-processed system in your debriefing, you are just changing the person's experience. And you don't know, it's not a systematic change. The company doesn't get the benefit of the lesson. And the individual's probably 50% at best taking that lesson and using it again rhythmically, routine-wise. So debrief can be a very empty process unless you've got, if you will, standardization, somebody who's the keeper of those procedures who will manage the incoming lessons learned to the appropriate level.
Well, I think, and listeners, for those of you who hate this phrase, well, this is the way we've always done it. If you hate that phrase, then I think, one, taking your procedures and you're taking your things and then having your event and then doing the debrief and then having that analysis, because then you can decide, and that was the question about innovating. How do you get someone to use a checklist and still have the creativity to innovate next? And I think if you hate the phrase, well, this is the way it's always been done, and instead get into this culture of innovation, debrief, and that additional 1% of gain, then that is a win for everyone.
It is. And the company gets better. You actually start looking at it with a different lens as well. If you're the leader, when you have a system in place that's operating to a certain standard, you can strategically think now 1 year, 3, and 5 years down range instead of fighting the fires that distract you from doing that because you've got a system in place. And most people I talk with, when they think they've got good procedures, I'll just take the procedures and go watch work. And then and if I see a deviation, and there's typically, there's two things I'll look at. One, the revision date on it. That tells me how often you're learning as a company. The back half of that is, if I can follow it step by step, can I go put my son, who I love dearly, I don't want anything to happen to him. If he can go do the work, you've got a great procedure because he doesn't know how to do your work. If it's transitioning or transmitting those work steps in that manner, you've got a success in your hand. But rarely does it work that well. Now, if you wanted to be an airline pilot, guess what? Their system does do that, and it does it exceptionally well.
I love that. And I think also just the idea of having this goal of continuing to improve it so that basically anyone can come off the street and follow the procedure. I've worked with, in my current role at Biolocity, we work with startup companies. So for example, I have a startup company that's developing a blood test that has to be done in the lab. And so they're writing their IFU, their information for use, which is the step-by-step procedure on how to do this test, okay? And what I said to them, I said, okay, now what I want you to do is I want you to take your IFU and your supplies and take it to a lab and don't tell the lab person anything and then take a step back. And I said, it's really important. I said, if I were you, what I would actually do is video this because you're also going to watch different things. And I said, take a step back, take notes, video, and see whether or not utilizing your IFU, they're able to successfully complete the test. And you'll get all those little gotchas when somebody else goes to do it and not when you go to do it. Because we often forget when we're writing procedures that we have this cognitive bias of the things that we think, oh, it's logical to do X, Y, and Z. So I'm not going to put that in there.
This is what I fix in procedures all the time. Of course I would do it that way. It's not in there. And I'm asking the question, And I'm like, but the problem is 97% of the time is correct. But how good do you want to be? Do you want to be 7 sigma reliability, or do you want 97%? And of course, it's not always about risk. You brought that up. This is good for manufacturing. It's good for really. Starbucks recipe book is probably one of the best SOPs out there. Oh, you'll find this fascinating. Walt Disney probably has the best set of procedures, period. When you get greeted at the gate, that's scripted. And they've got it scripted for all the different scenarios you're going to come across, right? Family, single guy, the 2 girls together. They've got it all scripted on how to greet you and make you feel welcome coming into to Disneyland. That is not somebody's experience executing. That is Walt Disney's standard you will be measured against to make sure you do that correctly.
So and I love that example. And also, we've been very blessed to have some amazing people from Chick-fil-A on the podcast. And I know within their systems and how they run their restaurants and how they do customer work within the restaurants, how much they've built into that as their standard of excellence. And that's the only way that they can have these high schoolers come in and have it for their first job and still crush it.
Yep. Love it.
So tell me this. So when I'm thinking about this, give me an example, because a lot of this also ties to change management. And so we talked about one piece of change management was finding your internal champion. So that's your Jose,
yep.
right? Finding that individual. Tell me some other, ways that you've navigated change management, or perhaps teams that you've done consulting for that have not been successful, and perhaps it tied to a change management challenge.
Yeah, so for a company that's made this commitment to go to like operational excellence, to be the top of the heap, right? To get there, you can see that I'm going to change a lot of what people do. And so in essence, to bring them along, one way I do it is that everybody's already competent. You're not starting out. You're already a fully functioning business and doing very well. So I'm not here to critique how you do business. You individually, if you're a full-time mechanic, okay? I'm here to now give you tidbits. Typically, I make the number up because I haven't measured it, but typically you're 95% compliant with the current procedures, right? There's the 5% I learned from somebody else that made a mistake, and it's applicable to you now. So you got to get a little bit of that buy-in, right? So I don't have to move the needle from 0 to 100. I'm just moving it from 95 to 99 and some change. So it's just explaining the changes that are going to come. When you break it down, is that if you talk to, let's say, if you reached out to a 20-year veteran, Joe Rogan on podcast, think of the knowledge he would pass on to you, right? But instead,
Joe, you also, hey, you can listen to this podcast and you can do comments and tell me all the areas I should improve in. So go ahead and go and do it. Or Simon Sinek. I mean, come on, I'm not going to be picky, but either of you go for
Black Box Thinking, another great book. But it's transition to those lessons, right? I mean, you're already very good at what you do. You don't have to go all that much farther to get to Joe level. And so now with that, it's reframing it, isn't it? It's not as bad as you think it is. And then you have to also draw the vision of how good do you want to be. You can challenge pride a little bit, because a lot of these people who are harder to move are the ones that are most proudful of the work and the experience they've gotten to at that level in life. And if they want to be the David Goggins, it's like, we're going to drive you to be even better. So there's a little bit of, I think pride could work in your favor as well. So
tell me this. What would you say the difference in this situation between pride and fear is? And I'll elaborate a little bit more. When you were saying that, I was thinking of a couple of things. When we talk about where does pride fall in a category and being humble fall in a category, and how does fear come in to say that either I'm fearful that I'm going to look bad, or I'm fearful I'm going to make a mistake, or I'm fearful that somebody else is going to think that I don't know what I'm doing, or any of these types of things. So I think of, like, if you were going to say pride and humility and fear, how would you say that they are intertwined?
Fear is driven by... Question. No, I think I've got a great solution for you. Fear is driven by their leader. If you're a leader that accepts mistakes, there is no fear about making mistakes, right? But if you're going to lead, this is interesting you say this. I kind of started going on the path because I've seen it from different levels. Leaders that use fear to do leadership usually has the worst culture.
Yep.
And they're afraid to make the mistake. They don't want to grow. And so to me, I don't blame the individual if I'm trying to make them better and be part of that system. I kind of look over to the left at the leadership team to go, I'm starting to understand more now the environment you're working in, which may not always be healthy. I mean, Elon Musk is king of this, right? Fear. He's so afraid. He's so not afraid of failure that he almost embraces it to a point. He doesn't want it, but he almost embraces it because he sees the learning opportunity. And I think that's been a key part of his element, his rise to where he's gone.
I love that. And one of the things, one of our other culture value things that Katie and I built into this is that we're lifelong learners. So I like to think of, I used to use the phrase fail fast, but instead we talk about learning fast and having this mindset of, oh, that did not work so well. For example, the podcast interview that I did with Charlie, that the audio did not record. We have to completely do it all over again. So we're like, okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to learn to have redundant systems set up so that we can do these things, and we're adding these processes.
Love
And
it.
it makes me think too of the quote that Thomas Edison, and I'm not going to get this right, but when his lab burned down and everyone's like, oh my gosh, all of these things. And he's just like, no, we've just burned down all of our mistakes. We can carry on now.
And so there's no fear in that workplace, and they'll probably grow 10 times because of it. Anybody who leads with it, honestly, is holding back the company.
Okay, let's talk then about what do you believe the difference between a leader and a manager is?
The leader influences the workforce. A manager manages.
I love that. And when you were talking about that example about if you see fear within the environment, you look to the leaders. I was listening to an episode of Jocko, and the episode where Simon Sinek was interviewing him, and he was given an example as a Navy SEAL where they had one of their SEAL commanders who was very dictatorship, very, not humble, and everyone hated him. And they basically revolted. They did a mutiny against him and got him replaced. And then the next leader was someone who was a legend in the Navy SEALs. And they really could see the difference. And that next leader, he came in and he was a legend, but then he also was so humble. And he was just like, we're all going to grow and be our best selves together.
Yeah, so remember I talked about accidents that we make, 99% of the people are trying to do the best they can? 1% actually maliciously wreck the system. The leader's acting like the 1% is 99, that they're actually purposely making the mistakes. So if you can understand, so one thing that's helped me a lot with BP is to explain people's mistakes. To go, hey, there's other things that contributed to why they made the decision they did on the well site that day. So let me take a look at it, pull it back, whether it's a circadian low, fatigue management. He's been on the road for 16 hours. Things. Start looking at the complete accident, not the initial report. I mean, what I've learned, and to think about the airline incidents recently, is that what gets reported that minute in time will not really mirror the investigation report when it's done. It's going to really explain the mishap chain. All you're looking for at that moment in time. You're looking at the accident. It's emotional. It's like if you think of Air India, it's 250 some people I think passes, one survivor. He pulls emotions out of people, and they're like, oh my gosh, pilot error, things like that. I'll promise you they'll go look into the system and find out there was multiple things that lined up that day that ended up in that crash. It's not just pilots that flew an airplane into the ground like that. It's not just one error. Whether it's a flap issue or not, it's not just one. There's multiple errors that are behind the scenes that the investigators will find and highlight in the report.
Yeah, I love that. And when you were just talking about the emotional piece, talking a little bit about emotional intelligence. So what role do you think emotional intelligence plays in leadership when you're dealing with safety, human error, and high reliability?
It's heavy. It's the acceptance of people are doing the best they can. I could see a change in culture because I came from a different lens coming down into the oil and gas world, and I just gave grace. People were like, Andrew's always walking around giving grace. And I'm like, if people know that, they know that I'm coming down to learn. It's interesting. We used to do 4 to 6 investigations a year, and then I roll in as VP of safety for them. And when I left, we were doing 80. And to me, it's the greatest measurement of they trusted me. They trusted the process. They knew I wasn't out there looking to blame and to fault. And they also believed in the process because they saw the corrective actions that would come out of it. And in doing so, they knew that was making them safer as well. So they just started telling me more what was going on. And as they told me more, it gave me quite a few more opportunities to fix their system.
Well, and I love that because, oftentimes I hear from back in my FDA clinical research days when we would do a CAPA for something, so corrective and preventative action. And I remember I went into a company and there are just a lot of things that needed to be improved. And I'm like, okay, we need to write a CAPA for this and for this and for that. And they were like, oh, no, we can't have a CAPA in our system. That's going to show a red flag for a future auditor. And I was just like, no. That is not how it works. They're going to actually see that you are doing your discipline of reviewing your own things, and they're going to look to see whether or not you're following the improvement now.
I struggle with this. That's a lagging indicator, right? People are using it the wrong way. They're not seeing the good that comes out of you reporting it. So I'm actually getting into the insurance world a little bit with the risk manager teams, because a lot of people, the way they run their safety departments are driven by what insurance wants. And they may not recognize the risk at the field level very well. So they're driving adherence to make sure their premiums and their insurances are covered correctly. To measure fatalities is a pretty bad measurement, right? Because then if you get one, and unfortunately, that's what a lot of industries use. I'm not saying it doesn't need to be measured. I think that's important. What's more important is wouldn't it be great to know what contributes to a fatality at your workplace and then know it proactively and prevent the accident? And that's where I try to come into systems and look at it and go, one of them you're going to find out is very obvious, is that I measure how many times you change your procedures. That's the sign of a learning organization. And it's got to, not just haphazardly, you got to have a good process. You don't change happy to glad in a manual. You've learned something that's going to add value to somebody else at work. That's transferring of knowledge. But I've gone down, there's some other leading indicators, like DAFWAC is days away from work, things like that. If somebody got hurt but they're not reporting, there's OSHA sets up standards, but they're all lagging. If you ask people what leading indicators do you have, you'll hear crickets a lot of the times as a response.
So how do you get a culture to convert? And we're talking about lagging versus proactive analysis, right? How do you get a culture to convert to understand why it's so important to do the proactive piece?
So this just fell in my lap, and it was one of another leader at the company came up with this idea, and I jumped on it. Was like, it's brilliant. So I knew I had a different lens. The aviation world's taught me that, so I knew I was good to go in that place. So I come down. We started doing more investigations. People would call me on the weekends and go, Andrew, you need to investigate it. Okay, so there's trust. If they're going to call me on the weekends, I'd run out and started hiring a team and getting a good cadre of folks who were looking at the system. So the next step was there was still apprehension behind it. And I'm moving a culture in this aspect. So we would do a debrief call with the field like twice a month on an investigation report. And what we would do is we structured it and we said, here's what happened. Here's what we found, and then we'd kind of be quiet for a little bit and then let the field tell us if we got it right or not. That took some learnings, quite frankly, because when you get channelized, think of System 2. When you do an investigation, you go into System 2, and you get where you don't see the gorilla necessarily. We would open it up to the field, and the field would go, no, Andrew, you guys missed this. And we did. And it took a little humility to go, you know what, we're going to open this up. Usually we would say it's a 95% product because we knew we didn't have it perfect. But the field started saying, no, you're not seeing it from this lens, or you didn't know about this. This incident's we'd hear this occasionally. That's happened 5 other times. We just didn't ask the right question the right way, didn't get the information. And so now we're like, nice. Okay, that's important. No, now there's a trend and why we did it. So then we'd go back and do the report, come back out and kind of close it. What happened on a phone call that used to be, maybe 30 to 50 people, it grew to 600. Almost half the company would tune in, and accountants and finance folks who are like, we support the front line, right, in a way different capacity, but to understand their mistakes and how you look at it, that's fantastic. And they just wanted to know what they were doing and if they had an implication on it. Now, interesting enough, then the finance team started asking me to do investigations. And the IT team had me to come do investigations because they would have a security breach. And they're like, Andrew, and I'm like, I've loved this part of my job because I don't know a lot about IT, but then I got to learn what bots are and how a bot got into our system and the breakdown in our system to prevent that from happening. And so I learned this, and maybe sometimes I have such a neutral lens that I don't know it very well, so I look at it with a little bit more wide-eyed. But we can fix our systems in place. They weren't worried about, well, yeah, I made a mistake, I'm hiding over here. It was, Andrew, there's contributing factors. Look at those as well so it never happens again. And it almost became, Okay, so the 2 week, two per month phone calls open up other people telling me what's going on. I think that truly didn't strategically plan it. It wasn't all, it was somebody else's idea. Put it in place, and it just was a home run to help shift the culture.
So tell me this, when you were just talking about some of that, I'm wondering, when we talk about human factors excellence, in an upcoming age of AI, how, I have to ask this question. Tell me a little bit, what was your initial response when I said that got that reaction out of you? Tell me more.
I'm still learning that space because it's actually might be my next book. So I'm kind of, here's what I do know.
So listeners, you heard it here. When you read his next book, remember, you heard it here first.
Yeah, because I've been real quiet about that, by the way. It changes the dynamics at work. Okay, so when I let somebody else do the work and now I'm a supervisor of a machine doing it, we disengage. As humans, we're really not good. We're actually really good at doing the work. Yes, we have some breakdowns occasionally, but we're really good to go do whatever work it is. Hand manual flying an airplane, running drill pipe, connecting utilities, all that stuff we're really good at. Automation does it better. Do you know Waymo, the automated cars and all that stuff that's going on?
Yes. I cringe every time I see one on the road without a driver in it. I still.
Oh yeah, because Atlanta's got them. Oh,
yes.
That's right. Yes. My wife and I used one in San Fran not too long ago, and actually it's awesome. But so there's a cultural issue of accepting the automation, right? But when I'm supposed to do the work and I'm still going to be present to make sure it's doing what it's supposed to do and the system's not breaking down, etc., it's really hard to keep the person engaged in it. That's going to be the difficulty. You're going to reduce human error in the work that it's replacing, but you're going to put somebody behind to supervise it, right? That supervised role is going to be really hard for the human because we're not good when we don't do work. We're going to be on our phones, our thoughts of what hoping the home life is going to go down. We're not going to really watch the work is where I'm going with it. You're going to get a bump out of execution without a doubt.
Yeah. I'm a big proponent of AI, and I serve on several boards at Georgia Tech, and we are doing a lot of work in AI. And I also can very much tell when someone sends me something and they let AI do the whole thing. Right. And I'm actually lecturing a master's class at Emory this fall, and I was writing my AI policy, and it says, I want you to use AI in an appropriate way. Know you will be held accountable, and I will also be able to tell if you haven't reviewed it and utilized it so that you can actually deliver something that's much more top-notch than you would be able to do in the same time by yourself.
So I would define appropriate.
That is a good question. Well, I mean, I think that's a good question. I don't know, Andrew. Stay tuned. After I define it. I love that challenge. Yes.
Well, that's how I write procedures, right? Because I don't like grayness. I do like to be as black and white as possible. And proper is another word I don't like. If you use proper with me, I'm going to be like, no, proper's not. This is the proper way, the proper handling.
Yeah.
General.
Yeah. Okay.
Boundaries.
And I love this. I'm picturing in my head what it says because I think the title is like the appropriate use of AI, and then it goes in to define it. But I absolutely believe that is a whole thing. I'm so glad you called me out on this. I think the whole thing is so subjective to so many different interpretations, which is not a procedure or a policy in that instance. So thank you.
I'd probably say you can use it to get the subjects and the context, but it's going to be your words when you write.
Exactly. Okay, are you ready to dig into some rapid fire questions?
I'll do my best.
Okay. So just say the first thing that comes to your mind. You're not being judged. It's only going on evergreen collateral that's going to be on the internet. So no big deal.
Katie, get ready to delete.
Okay, for you, Andrew, what does leaving a legacy mean to you?
It's actually important. You want context or not?
Yeah, absolutely.
I was really flattered after I retired out of BP. I got a note from a senior VP who came back. I'm not going to say he doubted my approach, but probably wasn't 100% bought in. And he sent me a note on LinkedIn who said, you did more in 2 years than I ever possibly could imagine, and your legacy lives on. And it came out of nowhere, and I realized, and not necessarily that was an objective, but it meant the world to me. It really made me feel good, and that the work, the time, and the effort put into it was well worth it.
Well, and one thing I want to say about that, Andrew, is to listeners, I would just encourage you to pause and think of an example where someone's legacy has had a positive impact on you. And then reach out to that person and tell them about that, because I had a former employee who I moved her. She was in sales at a company and she was not crushing it. And I had been observing her and I said, hey, I actually think you'd be a phenomenal project manager. And I moved her over, I mentored her, I funded for her to get project management classes. And then out of the blue, like 5 years later, I got a LinkedIn message from her and she's like, you completely changed my career. I'm so grateful. And I just sat there for a moment. It took her, 30 seconds to write me that message. So listeners, pause right now and hit subscribe. No, pause, subscribe, and then also send a message to someone who's made an impact on you and built a legacy. Okay, you ready for the next question?
Go.
Okay. What's the best advice you ever received?
So look at the situation from the other person's perspective.
Mic drop. That's amazing. Okay. What's one thing every leader should do daily?
I was going to say read, but then I also went to maybe just some quiet time, just some time to sit, and put 30 minutes on the schedule with nothing to do on it, and just maybe kind of plan a week or a year out.
I love that. And one of the things I like to do and to talk to people about, and I'm trying to get better, I'm not a morning person at all. And Katie will attest to that, as well as my assistant in my office. And however, I think the morning time is the best time that you actually own to yourself. So if you can start your day off with a little bit of that quiet time and introspective and ease into your day, I think that would really help a lot of leaders enter their day in the world in a much more calm perspective, highly, what do I want to say, enthusiastic, or just a perspective to where instead of entering, when I'm rushed in the morning, then I enter into situations in a hurry and I'm looking for the quickest solution to move on to the next thing. If I start my day a little more calm and introspective, do a gratitude list, maybe a meditation, and then enter the day, I seem to be much more calm and willing to hear solutions from other people.
Helps you manage chaos. Otherwise, chaos wins.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Helps you manage chaos. Otherwise, chaos wins. Ah, that's a gem. Okay. What is a book that changed the way you lead?
I can't say Radical Candor.
The 3 chapters I've read of Radical Candor.
I could say Bible, but you're asking for leadership in the business place, although great principles.
I don't see any problem with saying the Bible. I think there are many great leadership perspectives in it.
Yeah, there are. And I think to go back into it and reread it again with that lens is probably of value.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, what's the most surprising lesson you've learned in your career?
Take risk.
Tell me more.
To leave aviation, I was a pilot, and the pilots kind of think that's all you can do. But you actually manage a team, you lead a team, you make risk decisions. There's a lot of the skill sets. I think making the transition to be a consultant is certainly something that I knew nothing about. It was just to accept it and try it. Most people, I would say, they'd go find another pilot job. If you got furloughed, you're going to go try to work for a smaller company, maybe a private company. And I went way out on the limb to do it this way.
I love it. I love it. One of the things that when I talk to engineers and mentor them, I say, look, your education wasn't the formulas and all of that. You were learning how to solve problems. As long as you know how to solve problems, you can then pivot in any industry. And I think that's what you did. You learned throughout your, the Marines and all of it as a fighter pilot, and then as a pilot in the airlines, how to solve problems. You had a problem where the financial situation crashed, and then you said, where can I apply these skills that I know in a way that's going to make the world a better place for someone else?
Yeah, you said it way better than I.
Okay, what is your go-to strategy when you're under pressure?
Manage distractions.
Ooh. How do you manage distractions? What tool do you use to do that?
You want a quick story?
Yeah.
When you're flying in the back of a commercial airliner, and when you hear ding ding passing 10,000 feet, you don't know the altitude, but it's 10,000 feet typically.
Yep.
And then
I know I can get my laptop out.
You know what they're saying? Do you know what they're actually telling you?
What?
We're no longer in sterile cockpit. So you can now, as a flight attendant, call the cockpit and say, hey, we got to do this. This is what's coming on. They can only call us below 10 grand in emergency situations. So we manage distractions in a high workload environment, high stress environment, because we don't want something that's not important, non-threatening, if you will, become a distraction. We go to the wrong altitude, miss a call from ATC. So I would say that habit, check this out. That came from an airplane accident. That was one thing that came and changed our industry, was that we need a tool that manages distractions better. I just adopted it in my world as well, with consulting and flying, to go, when the heat's on, I don't have the time to chase something that's certainly lower risk or lower priority. So I hole up phones, quiet, doors closed, things like that.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. And I thought it was just that we reached the altitude I could get my laptop out of my bag and start working, or that the Wi-Fi was working. Now I'm fully going to have a completely different perspective of that when I hear that ding now. And the next thing I was going to ask you was one tool or habit that helps you stay focused. And so I think that's one. Do you have another one that you can think of?
Yeah, you reminded me, you were talking a little bit ago, in the mornings in that quiet time, when I kind of strategize for the day, I would write a checklist. In my world, it's a to-do checklist now, right? Today I want to accomplish these things. And that way, if something else pops up, I don't worry about completing checklists. I'm not like a fanatic in that space, but I think it sharpens my focus. It kind of risk ranks what needs to get done, what doesn't. And if something else pops up that's more important, it's easy for me to place it in where it belongs and push down things further on and just carry it the next day. So I would have that to-do list carried over the next day. It would come into Wednesday, and I'd reassess it, kind of think about, maybe long-term and short-term, and I would just live from that. But I don't want to overcomplicate it. It was pretty a simple form is what it was.
I love that. Okay, so tell us what's next for you, and what do you want to be known for?
Next. I wouldn't mind getting into the medical world. I think there's some opportunity for me to kind of, I've worked off and on, but it's been a few years. But what I learned with oil and gas and BP specifically, I think is applicable to really a lot of other industries and organizations. I would love to try to, part of it's the challenge, I think. And so I wouldn't mind trying to go after something, egos or not. A lot of doctors are pilots. So there's a pretty good analogy with aviation in the world as well. I know they've really grown the last 15 years. But I still think the standardization, certainly with some of the large organizations that have many doctors working for them, there's probably an opportunity to really improve their performance.
Well, I love that. And I think one of the things you'll see in many doctors, because, for example, when we're in surgery, they also have the checklist. It's very much like you were talking about. It's the after the check. Like, what was the patient's name? Or did we mark the right leg? So we're not cutting off the right leg versus the left? And so there's been so many studies on the value of like hand sanitizers, how to scrub up, and the value of those things. I think then, if you know how to deal with the personalities, which you do know how to do, because as you mentioned, they're very similar. And I can say this to all of my doctor friends that I worked with for a long time. I will tell you this funny story. So I was working for Medtronic and running this first-in-man clinical trial. And I was one of the two proctoring experts in the U.S. And so I was training a lot of other proctors, but then I was also the one that would go in, especially for physicians who'd never done this procedure before, right? You would have me come in. Well, I learned when I was very young that one key is that you cannot let that doctor look bad in front of their team. So I learned how to guide them in the right direction and still make them look good, right? And I remember the funniest moment was one day I'd worked with this one physician for a while, and I said something to him, and he was a character. He looked at his scrub tech, and he goes, "That's Angela's way of telling me I'm doing this completely wrong." I just died laughing. So I think that if you could, going into the medical field, if you could figure out a way that adds that level of efficiency that can then translate into patient time, or translate into less paperwork, or translate into the things that are really making so many doctors leave. If you were just to analyze why are so many doctors leaving the field of medicine, and then figure out whatever you could do that then mitigates those so that they're actually back to what they love to do. I bet you could get some raving fans probably write a book and then be known for it and then completely change healthcare.
I'm in.
Alrighty. Well, thank you. Oh, before I forget, do you know what the last thing on this podcast is? The requirement is that every guest has to share their favorite motivational quote. So, Andrew, what is your favorite motivational quote?
What's the best learning? An accident. Because so too many times people come to me after they've had it, and I so want to work for somebody that sees the value before they have it.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for your time today. This was amazing. I learned so much. I now have to go fix my syllabus for my class and what is acceptable.
Appropriate is not appropriate anymore.
No, this is amazing. Once again, thank you for saying yes. Thanks for bringing the badass to this podcast. We are both really grateful.
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for joining me for today's episode of the Badass Leaders Podcast. To hear more interviews with industry experts and learn how to grow your career and leadership potential, be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to ensure you do not miss future episodes. This podcast is a production of the AGN Group. To learn more about the AGN Group, visit our website at theagnGroup.com. There, you can discover more about our services, which include hosting workshops, management consulting, brand strategy, keynote speaking, and more. Follow us on all social media channels shown on the screen and displayed in the show notes. And until next week, be brave and be badass.